This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with Peter Holland, McMeel Family Professor of Shakespeare Studies in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater, University of Notre Dame. We will begin by taking a close look at Peter's recent book entitled Shakespeare and Forgetting. This series is funded with support from the Aoyama Gakuin University Institute of the Humanities and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Peter, welcome to the program. We're so happy to have you here, and happy Thanksgiving to you.
Thank you, and a happy Thanksgiving to you, however you're celebrating it in Japan.
For some
I remember
reason,
a while ago when I'd been at Notre Dame just 2 or 3 years, and the very nice local woman who was the administrative assistant for my department looked at me and said, "How do you celebrate Thanksgiving in England?" And I said, "But we don't." And she was completely and utterly floored by the thought that we didn't. I said we could celebrate the fact that we got rid of the colonies, but it doesn't kind of work.
Well, it doesn't work in Japan either. In fact, they ramp up the work week this time of our term, and it's always a disappointment. I am nostalgic, from my childhood in America. And so just wonderful to have you. What I wanted to start out with your book and get onto that pretty quickly. This is a recent book. I believe the timing of this program, I believe we can expect a paperback edition of this.
That's right.
Also.
Paperback due out, I'm told, in February, which is really good news, because academic books being the price they are, paperback may make all the difference.
Absolutely.
To whether some people can get to read it.
Absolutely. And this is Shakespeare and Forgetting. And we're going to talk about that now. And this book has challenged me, Peter. I have read several parts of it twice because it does get complicated. There's an enormous amount of critical theory and philosophical as well as scientific studies in the human physiology. This area covers everything from day-to-day life to our most spiritual or reflective thoughts.
Well, I'm glad you felt that way. I found it just an endlessly fascinating topic. When I first came to Notre Dame, and that's now just over 20 years ago. This is my 21st year at Notre Dame. I thought that it would be a good idea to establish a conference, to hold a conference, because the endowed chair I hold is a brand new one. I'm the first holder of it. And I wanted to celebrate the wonderful family that made it possible. And I was looking around for the topic, and memory studies were just beginning to be really important in Shakespeare work. And so I wanted to look at the intersection between Shakespeare and memory and performance. But I found that my own contribution to that conference, and we turned it into a book with Cambridge University Press not long afterwards, I got very interested in the idea of forgetting. That somehow the vast expansion up to that point, and very much since that point, in memory studies, has lost sight of the fact that most of the time, much of what we do, we forget about. Indeed, we forget almost everything. And I'm not just talking about, as we get older, names go, and who was that person, and where did I put that book, and where are my glasses? I'm talking about something else, which is about the way in which every time we go to the theatre, for instance, and we come out, we have forgotten on the way out 98% of what just happened. That we really don't retain that much of the performances we go to. Even people like me who pride ourselves on being professional, thoughtful, scholarly theatre goers, unless I'm actually taking notes, my brain doesn't retain it. The overload of sensory information in the theatre gets in the way. And I'm fascinated by the way in which Shakespeare characters forget things, by the ways in which we forget about characters in Shakespeare. How is it that at the end of Lear, we're not sitting on the edge of our seats saying, I wonder where Lear and Cordelia are. Instead of which, all those things go on, and then suddenly Edmund reminds us, my writ is on the life, and oh my gosh, and I hadn't thought about it for all this time. I mean, my bad. Shakespeare
Yeah.
wants me to be that bad. He wants my forgetfulness. And that seems to me a fascinating area. And
Yeah.
it's partly because it is fundamentally, and this is crucial to my thinking about it, an involuntary activity.
uh, an involuntary activity. And you're focusing here, and I think our viewers should know this. You're focusing on forgetting as
Yes,
something as a distinct thing that's not the opposite of memory, but as you show in your introduction, and other people have talked about, intermixed, inextricably entwined with memory, and also not
absolutely.
forgetting as a pejorative all the time.
Yeah.
That sometimes it is necessary, and sometimes we willfully forget, and those types of forgetting.
We would like to forget. Sometimes we find we're unable to forget the things that we most want to remember. And sometimes we rather helplessly cannot forget something that is trauma. It may be blocked, but it may resurface. So when Hamlet is saying, in response to the ghost, that he will, from his memory, wipe all trivial fond records, he's talking about an impossibility.
Mm, mm,
He's talking about deliberately setting out to erase his own memory.
mm,
Now, I can erase things on my computer. I can choose to delete things. And I know that if it came to it, the FBI could probably find it somewhere in the cloud. But for all normal purposes, I can delete things. And indeed, from time to time, we've all deleted things by mistake.
mhm.
But in terms of our own brains, as opposed to the memory systems we use, we don't make that as a deliberate choice.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I became fascinated years ago, long before really I got into this topic, because of a wonderful book by Luria, the great Russian neuropsychologist. And it's called The Mind of a Mnemonist. It's
mhm.
one of those words we can't quite say, mnemonist.
Nice.
Um, and it was about a subject he worked with for years who had the most phenomenal memory. And this guy had been a journalist, and his boss got cross with him because he'd given him all kinds of instructions, and the guy hadn't taken any notes. And his boss said, "How dare you not take notes about what?" And he simply repeated back to his boss, word for word, exactly what his boss had said, because he had this simply phenomenal memory. And after a while, as Luria worked with him and discovered the extent of that memory, the man was working as a kind of vaudeville artist, a memory man, a bit like the man in the 39 Steps. That's the one I always think
Ah,
about,
yes,
Mr.
yes,
Memory, who knows about the organization called the 39 Steps. But he
yes.
was given kind of number strings and would remember them and so on. And he realized that he was overloading his memory with useless number strings. And then he
Mhm,
had to solve a puzzle.
mhm.
How can I forget them? Because his memory wouldn't let him forget, whereas my memory and yours won't let us remember most
Remember.
of what we want to remember. And so I'm just fascinated by that as an alternative world, a world where you can't forget but wish to forget, like that beautiful character that Borges created in the story we used to know as Funes the Memorious, Funes the Memory Man, who is unable to function because of the excess of his memory.
Mhm, mhm.
And I'm just intrigued by that as one aspect of it, and then that contrary thing that has become so powerful for us in literary circumstances, film, and in TV and all other circumstances, as well as in our own lives, the horror of Alzheimer's and the realization that someone may be going to that point where they will remember nothing.
Mhm.
They cannot possibly retain memory
Yeah,
of
yeah,
even things that are trivial day-to-day activities.
yeah,
And we all know somebody who's gone through it, and we know even more the stress and strain on their
yeah.
partners for going through it. So my book is really concerned with many things, and it ranges far and wide, and sometimes it kind of doesn't want to remember where it's going.
Oh no, I thought when I was yesterday I was reviewing a couple of things, and I'm thinking, it's a wonderful thing that Peter Holland ended up in the Midwest, because this freedom is sort of like you're on the plains there, is
Oh yeah,
and you feel perfectly free to wander through Shakespeare and wander out and then wander back through Shakespeare. And I love the way that works. I love the interconnectedness with the
thank you.
Shakespeare and the kind of world that you're building here. Thought project that just, for those of us in the business, it triggers us to think about other examples. There's so many, they're endless.
They're endless, and I don't aim to be in any way covering all the field, or the book will be very long indeed. It's quite long enough. But I remember I'd been on leave and I came back, and I was then an associate dean, and my dean said to me, how's the book going? And I said, well, I've got a long way during my leave. I'm really pleased with the progress. And he said, and what's the thesis of the book? And I looked at him and I said, I know you won't believe this, John, but there isn't one. And he really was completely shocked by the idea that there wasn't a thesis. And I think my problem is, and I don't know whether you have the same problem, but many academic monographs I read these days, I don't read. I mean, that is, I read the introduction and perhaps the first chapter, and then I read the particular case study that interests me because I know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And in my book, well, no, the chapter that might be the kind of theory chapter at the beginning is about halfway through, because I wanted to get towards it, not to plant it at the beginning, like conquering the mountain and planting the flag, and ask people to do a bit of work thinking about these things with me,
Yeah.
not my thinking for them.
That's right. You promise your reader that you will get to the framework. If it's not a thesis, that's a framework that
Certainly
you're
a friend.
working with later on, maybe toward the end even. But let us go then, you and I, through this whole
I
journey.
love that experience. One of the greatest lectures I ever heard at a conference was by Peter Lake, the historian, brilliant historian. And he was giving a paper and I was sitting listening to it. And I thought, it's a surprise he hasn't talked about this. And about a minute later, he said, well, most of you are probably sitting there thinking, I wonder why he hasn't talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did the same thing a bit later on. I was puzzling. Surely he's going to touch on this problem.
Uh-huh.
And then he said, you're probably sitting there thinking, surely I'm going to touch on this problem. And I love the way in which he made me work to stay with him.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew what I was thinking, as it were. He knew what the audience was looking as a possible loophole in his argument, a failure to consider. And then he offered that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was so delightful, so brilliant, so much that not I'm going to take your hand and lead you through something I've already mapped, but I'm going to make you work to map it with me.
Mm-hmm.
That the best charts are ones we create together, not the ones I lay out for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how I've always preferred working. It's how I hope my readers enjoy the journey.
Yeah.
A journey that they are working at, not just being carried along by.
Yeah, well, this is such a readable book. And yes, I confess to having read almost whole academic books from the index to the page that I wanted, to the specific quotation or area, section that I wanted, and realizing after a year or two that I've read most of the book that way, in bits and pieces. And this is straight through. And also, one thing that struck me, we know you as an editor and as an editor's editor, an enormous amount of work that you've been involved with, along with your scholarship and criticism and that sort of thing. But the editorial eye and this type of book don't seem to be in conjunction with one another. Yet, as I think about it more, I think it very much is, because of these moments of serendipity, maybe, that you run across as an editor when you see these details, that you can come back around and say, okay, you know how we put things on the shelf and say, I'm going to look into this a little bit more later. But isn't this interesting? You know, as I'm going this way, I see these other things, and that's a sort of tour that you're taking us on through the Shakespearean part of this book.
I love editing. I thoroughly enjoy it. And particularly I love editing Shakespeare and writing commentary notes. Indeed, I find writing commentary notes much more fun than writing the introduction. Whereas I know many other people, it's entirely the other way around. And I love those details, those moments of realizing that's what he's getting at that moment. And oh, this is the reference that comes up, or this is the shade, the multiple shades of meaning he's playing with at this moment. And you know, when I teach a course, as I do regularly here at Notre Dame on editing with my graduate students from any part of the English department, not just the ones who may be early modernists, and I tell them that, you know, a good editor lies awake in the middle of the night worrying about whether that comma should or should not be there in a line of the text, and I get that baleful look of disbelief. And then as the semester continues, usually most of them say to me at some point, you know what, I was worrying about a comma in my sample that I was working on for you in exactly the way you describe. Isn't it fun? Isn't it fun? And that's the point. It wasn't that it's a worry that stresses you, but it's a fun puzzle to be working with.
Yeah, it surely is. And I have become more and more involved, you know, as we teach these texts over and over, and I'm in a second language situation. So it is, I have to explain, we all do, even in first language situations, you know, you have to explain what lines mean. And the big problem with that is that you have to know what they mean yourself, or at least you have to come to it prepared to talk about what it might mean.
Or you sometimes have to say, I really don't know what this line means.
Or else,
it's a puzzle and I can't resolve it. And the accumulation of that commentary is a wondrous thing. One of the mighty works that I've been using as I'm working on my current project, I'm editing King Lear for the Arden Shakespeare 4th series, is the most recent major scholarly edition. It's the one that Richard Knowles created for the New Variorum series. And it is a mighty work in every conceivable ways, and a weighty work. It's 2 hefty volumes in tiny type, each of over 1,000 pages. So this edition is well over 2,000 pages long of tiny type. And I sit there straining my eyes, reading, sometimes with a magnifying glass when I get overtired, reading this accumulation of commentary and the thoughtful, careful, modest, evaluative way in which Richard Knowles weighs up what so many centuries of commentary have been for particular lines, and reaches sometimes a conclusion and sometimes not, sometimes just offering different examples, sometimes pointing out silly flaws in some scholars' reasoning that has led them somewhere, be it an 18th century scholar or a 20th century scholar. And yet all of that commentary is fascinating and well worth reading. All of those suggestions by others that we need to evaluate and make sense of before we reach our own temporary solutions, and they're only ever temporary.
Yeah. Well, this segues with the idea of forgetting, and the idea that so much is forgotten. And you and I can go back to our youth and remember movies and bands and trend, all kinds of things that have been completely forgotten. It just surprised me when I brought up the name a couple of years ago, Bob Dylan, in one of my classes, and most of these kids had no idea who I was talking about. That's Bob Dylan, right? And then you take it into textual editing, and you know better than most everyone in the world, you know that a text that comes out in a quarto edition, some certain things appear, and then it comes out in the folio edition 20 years later, let's say, and things have changed, and I just had several thoughts on this, but we may get to them. But in that 20-year period, some of those changes have to do with the fact that quarto bit has been culturally forgotten, not necessarily forgotten by the people who edited the folio edition, but they just are not pertinent anymore. The joke is not funny as it was in 1601 or that kind of thing.
That is certainly true, and we all know that experience of students saying to us, "Where are the jokes? I don't understand what's funny at this point." Right?
Yeah.
Uh, I have that all the time when I listen to one of my favorite forms of pleasure, Gilbert and Sullivan, and there are clearly jokes in Gilbert's libretti that are now completely and utterly lost. And I go to, annotated editions, the annotated Gilbert and Sullivan and so on, the annotated Savoy operas, and nobody can quite elucidate what on earth he's on about at that moment. And in the end, I find that doesn't matter, because I can still relish the extraordinary rhyming, the great delight in language, which Gilbert exudes at every moment in his texts. And that's in itself the pleasure, even if I don't get the gag.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed some years back the movie Topsy Turvy.
Oh,
Explained
absolutely.
quite a lot, didn't it? In a way, it was a kind of annotation of both Gilbert and Sullivan, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Beautifully well done, and wonderful way to bring Gilbert and Sullivan back into the public consciousness.
And it was all about that endless feud between them. I mean, we
Yeah.
think of them as a natural double act, and in fact, it
Oh.
was an extremely fraught relationship. And there must have been moments like that for Shakespeare with the company. Come
Oh,
on,
yes.
there must have been that moment. The late, much lamented Anthony Sher has this line that it's a little known fact that after Richard III had gone through its first performances, Burbage said to Shakespeare, "If you ever do that to me again, I'll kill you." That putting somebody through the ordeal of the hunchback, the limp, the withered arm, that's really, really tough. And I remember years ago at the RSC, David Troughton playing the role, and he had an agreement with the company that he could have as many remedial massages as he needed. He said no role is worth damaging your health for. Or indeed, when Sher played it, he had two humps, a left one and a right one. So he wasn't always twisting his body in the same way. That was designed just to ease the intense physical pain of playing a role like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember the movie. I think it was a Neil Simon play, Goodbye Girl, and there's a joke in there about the director convinced that Richard was gay, and also and so the actor had to go through the whole thing. There was a joke in all of that. It might not play as well now. It might seem to be a little bit insensitive, but I don't think so. I think that's the point being that directors get these things in their heads and try to add on to Shakespeare, who is already adding on plenty, particularly with Richard. And but you have to make it new because of what's remembered. You don't want to give people something they've already seen.
Yes.
I'm getting now confused. But I think this is a point that you make, the idea of going to a play and being satisfied with it not being that different, knowing that you've been edified.
That's an old thing that we've somehow lost. And
yeah.
I mean, I think the area in which it's often still present is in opera.
Yeah.
And a company like the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden will keep a particular production in its repertory for decades, literally decades.
Yeah.
The cast may change, but the set and the production is still pretty close to what they originally did. And I think of what it was like in the middle of the 18th century, when for over 40 years, Macklin played Shylock. And I don't
Yes.
think Macklin's performance changed across that time greatly. It wasn't that he had a sudden, oh, I can't do it that way. I've done it like that for the last 38 years. I better change it now. No, people came to see it the same again. And I remember as a child going to see Gilbert and Sullivan, since we were talking about Gilbert and Sullivan. And of course, the only way you could see professional Gilbert and Sullivan in my childhood was the productions of the D'Oyly Carte Company that toured around, and they stayed absolutely the same.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to see the same show. We
Mm-hmm.
wanted the same bits of stage business. We
Mm-hmm.
wanted the same extra gags at the same
Absolutely.
time. Every time you went to see the Mikado, you wanted to see that bit again.
All right. If they don't pull out those fans with Three Little Maids from School, if they don't
Exactly.
have that going,
Exactly.
then it's just not Gilbert and Sullivan,
Exactly.
because that's what we remember, and that's the way we've been trained to enjoy this. So
I
yeah.
keep hoping that, sometimes, of course, I'm excited by new productions of Shakespeare. Of course I am. I'm thrilled by discoveries and ways of thinking that a director, an actor, a designer, the whole company can create in a particular place at a particular time that makes me think about a play in a totally different way.
Hmm.
But I also love those productions that I can go back to.
Mm-hmm.
And that now, particularly in our current era of widespread recording of theatre productions, that absolutely exhilarating new phenomenon.
Yes.
I,
Yes.
I noticed, I got the other day the standard email from the National Theatre telling me about what was coming up in the next few months and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that's coming up is a play about the production of Hamlet in 1964 on Broadway, directed by Sir John Gielgud and starring Richard Burton.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a play about what was a complex and in some ways troubled relationship and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we can watch that production because it was filmed in what was then thought of as a brand new thing called, wait for it, Theatrovision. And it was filmed on 3 days, and they edited it from that footage. And then it was released for movie theater screenings all across America with detailed instructions. Judith Buchanan has done wonderful research on this, to the cinema managers about how to make sure their patrons would enjoy this experience. Plenty of fresh flowers in the foyer, make sure the restrooms have been properly cleaned, all of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then all copies were sent back and destroyed, except one copy was given to Burton. And that copy is the only one that survived.
Ah.
So when you put your DVD in to watch that production, as you can do, thank goodness Richard Burton didn't throw it away along with everything else,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's how we've still got a detailed visual record of that production.
Yeah.
How thrilling.
Yes. Well, so much. This goes right back to forgetting. So much is lost in the theater. We talk about what people remember, what they respect, what they expect, and you spoke earlier about how much we lose before we even get out of the door. But this idea of being able to film so easily everything that's put on, and really a kind of need to do that. I mean, you sort of owe it to the cast and owe it to the director and all the people who work so hard. It's that thing about the performances when it finishes its run. It just goes into air, and we talk about something we saw in 1982 or 1993. However, I was just thinking as you were talking about the fact that I saw, and I won't say when and where, just this miserable production of The Tempest. The actors were good, the director was good, it just didn't fall together. It just wasn't good. And I'm thinking, I bet the members of that cast are very happy that that was not recorded.
I know, and the art of the ephemeral is sometimes deeply to be desired.
Yeah.
But my students find it difficult to believe that things are not always everywhere available. And of course, I talk in class about productions that I saw before they were born, before their parents were born, sometimes before, almost now, I suppose, their grandparents were born. And they look at me in a rather kindly mode of shock about this. Why do I want to go back to a production I saw now, sometimes 60 years ago, that something I was taken to as a child, that has stayed with me. A moment in it has stayed with me. And I cherish those, and there are things about those moments that deserve to be remembered.
Yeah.
I'm teaching this semester a course called simply King Lear, and the students have been reading the play with me slowly, week by week, for the first half of the semester, and now we've been exploring different kinds of productions and different kinds of films, and I have been able to show them and for them to think about Peter Brook's wonderful film version with Paul Scofield.
Yeah.
Astonishing piece of film.
It really is. It really is.
Every time I watch it, it blows me away all over again. But I also have some memories because my parents took me to see King Lear when I was pretty young, at the Old Witch in London. And there are things I remember from that experience that didn't make it into the film.
Yeah.
Couldn't have made this into the film because they were theatre things.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a famous moment at the end of the first half, and the first half of that show was 2 hours long. I remember it said in the program, there's an intermission after 2 hours, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, you mean I've got to sit here for 2 hours? Yeah. And the moment was after the blinding of Gloucester.
Oh my,
and Brooke had cut, as the folio cuts, the servants in Quarto who look after Gloucester, who go off to fetch some flax and white of eggs to anoint his eyes, and so on, and to take him to the Bedlam beggar to lead him, and so on. All of that, folio doesn't give, and Brooke cut. And instead of that, what happened at the end of that long first half was a blind Gloucester trying to find his way off the stage, as servants rushed to and fro and knocked into him, and they were far too busy to be bothered with this figure. And the house lights came up while he was still trying to find his way off stage.
Oh, yeah.
And we were part of that world in which nobody was helping Gloucester.
Yeah.
Stunning.
Stunning. Absolutely stunning to do that. It reminds me of the break, you give me some light, or give me light, and the lights, that's maybe all the way through has been a cue to bring in some light, even before there was electricity. So you can only get that in the theater.
That's a theater movie. And I don't mean, therefore, you can't film it. You can film it, but you have to remember, well, what you're watching is something that plays differently in the theater at that moment from the way you watch it now on a recording, even if there is a recording available. And how the camera movement controls what you can and cannot see is a very powerful effect. Just a few weeks ago, I was running a workshop for the Folger Institute on this whole question of live theatre broadcast, the live theatre experience, and what that's all about, working with two very brilliant colleagues, Pascal Ibischer from the University of Exeter and Erin Sullivan from the Shakespeare Institute of the University of Birmingham. And one of the things we explored was the way in which the camera moves in particular ways and what that does and how it controls our seeing. Mm-hmm. And I went back a little way after that to watch again the very end of the very first Royal Shakespeare Company live from broadcast, which was Richard II. And there was a trick at the end of that production, a wonderful theatre trick. The coffin is brought on, Bolingbroke is looking at it, he gives the last lines, and then a spotlight picked out on the gallery behind him, the ghost of Richard II, as it were, David Tennant standing there, looking down at Bolingbroke.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you are in the theatre, I remember seeing Tennant taking up his position before the light caught him. On the recording, the camera is going through a very elaborate movement. Bolingbroke just stiffens slightly. He's aware of something that makes him uncomfortable, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And then the camera shows us Richard up in that gallery. So it tells us when he appears.
Yes.
It makes us see that moment of appearance.
Yeah.
I spoiled it. I happened to see Tennant move. I happened to see him arrive on the gallery. For myself, it wasn't the same thing.
It wasn't the same thing. It couldn't be the same thing. Yeah, I do have to explain every semester to students that, let's say we're doing Midsummer Night's Dream, that the reason that they're going on so long about all of the natural things is that you have to put those images of nature in the minds of your audience. You don't get the, we watch bits of film versions and so forth. The camera can pick up all of that, can pan over the flowers and do all kinds of things. Have a pit orchestra, basically, background music all the way through. Wonderful stuff. And yet you can't get it, though, I don't think, unless you see the effort in that and many all the plays, but particularly in Midsummer Night's Dream, the effort to get Midsummer into the minds of the audience. I'm just convinced that it was a winter production, that it was because sort of like the pamphlets you get from the tour agency. Let's go to Fiji. It's when it's February, right?
Right.
That it just had to be that sort of thing, that was part of the enjoyment of watching that play, that it was freezing cold outside and that you maybe could make it summer in your mind, right?
But at the same time, there's that long description by Titania of the horrors of climate change. About the failure of summer to be summer, about the things that are amiss, and that extraordinary ending of that speech. We are their parents and original.
We are. Yeah.
It's our fault that this is happening.
Yeah.
That because there is dissension between Titania and Oberon, the seasons have gone awry.
Yes.
Well, at a time of climate change, boy, that speech has a very different sense.
Doesn't it, though?
As things happen that I experienced directly. When the temperature in England last summer hit 103, and it was record breaking, and no one has aircon in their homes, or when suddenly I look on television at appalling flooding in Pakistan or wherever it may be, the unprecedented effects of climate change. That speech echoes back for me, but it's of course we who are their parents and original, not the king and queen of fairies. We are responsible.
Yes. It puts it on the audience, doesn't it?
Totally.
Speech. Yeah. I'm going on treacherous ground here, speaking about Midsummer Night's Dream with a famous editor of the play, and so. But I am interested in this, and again, going back to memory, I know that your edition. And it's there's an Arden edition. You did the
I do the Oxford edition.
Oxford edition, and for very good reasons, you have Aegis step in, as in the folio version, instead of Philostrate, and there's a strong argument for that. And I was working on a little paper that is, I don't think it's ever going to come out. As the press, the pandemic and so forth. But I was looking at Philostrate in particular in the folio, I'm sorry, the quarto, the earlier edition, and I think that's a what do you say? Taking the piss a little bit, taking the piss out of Tilney. Because Tilney was the master of the rebels and so forth.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking by the time the folio edition came out, that was no longer a pertinent or funny joke, because
the gag probably doesn't work in the same way. No, I think you're right. I have vivid memories of a talk. There was a wonderful guy called Bert Parnaby. Bert had been a school teacher and then became one of Her Majesty's inspectors of schools He was one of the people who went around to schools and told them what they were doing wrong. And eventually, late in life, he decided that he would do what he had always wanted to do, which was to be an actor. And I listened to him give a talk about playing Philostrate. And he gave a talk that lasted a standard 50 minutes talk about his experience of playing Philostrate in what was then the current Royal Shakespeare Company production. Except in that production, Aegeus got all the lines in Act 5, which means his Philostrate didn't have a single word to say.
That's right.
Because Philostrate doesn't speak when he appears in Act 1. And there was Bert giving this wonderful account of what was going through Philostrate's mind and all the rest of it through this whole experience of a wordless performance. It was just delightful. It was a wonderful lesson about what fun an actor can have developing a character who in this production doesn't get a goddamn word.
There are other examples too. Leonardo in Much Ado has a wife, and
Yes.
with no lines.
And who appears not once but twice.
Yeah.
I mean, there are 2 stage directions for her entry, and never gets a line. I've seen productions that have put her on stage and tried to do something with her. I think Shakespeare began with the idea he might create something of this character. He gives her a name, Imogen. Well, that's significant. It's a name he's going to remember and use again the time he gets to Cymbeline. But I think it's one of those classic ghosts where he had an idea and then didn't follow through on it and forgot to cut the stage directions, and nobody bothered to correct the prompt book or whatever else. The book holder's copy still had it in, but nobody was ever cast in the role in The King's Men. It never actually happened, but somehow it stayed there into the text. It's there in print, but that's the kind of thing I think that often happens. I think Shakespeare forgot to cut it. That's another kind of forgetting.
Yeah.
And it's just like the game I always play with my students when we're working on Hamlet. And I ask them, if you go and watch Hamlet, what's the name of Hamlet's stepfather? His uncle. And they all say, Claudius. And I say, how do you know? Well, it's his name, it's in the speech prefixes and so on. Yes, but the name Claudius is never spoken in the play.
Yeah.
It exists as one entry direction and in one text, a speech heading.
Yeah.
He has no name. The name doesn't exist. I mean, I think this is one of the games that Shakespeare plays, or he found the name, knew the name, thought about using the name, forgot to give anybody a chance to speak the name, and so the name isn't known. In an era before programs, playbills, whatever we're going to call them, you don't know what a character's name is unless they say it. And sometimes he does that so deliberately, like the fact that, in Twelfth Night, Viola is only named in Act 5.
Yeah.
All through the rest of the play, she's only had one name, Cesario, the assumed name. Her real name is never in play until it's conjured up in that conversation with her brother.
Yeah, you had me looking through the a couple of editions that I have of Hamlet because I never saw that. I was absolutely certain that somebody says Claudius somewhere in there, and no. Yeah.
I mean, I'm afraid I can be a very wicked teacher and occasionally play tricks on my audience, but on my students. But it's like, why do we talk about a balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet? Because the word balcony is never spoken.
No.
And what we hear about, what Romeo tells us to look at, is the light that is breaking through yonder window. Not a balcony. The balcony is a late 17th century invention. Or why do we talk about Lear out in the storm on a heath when the word heath is never spoken? Well, it's because in the Restoration, when Nahum Tate's edition was created, the one with the happy ending. Tate noted down what scenery was to be used, and at one point he talks about the Heath scene.
Yeah. Yeah, this plays straight into one of the theorists that you mentioned earlier in the book, that how memory is this act of reconstructing, forgetting certain things. I don't want to talk about origins, but earlier forms, and remembering them differently because of things that happened later. And you can see this in your editorial work when you go through all the way through to Theobald and Pope and all the way through up to modern editions. You can see how things are just added on that just become remembered as Shakespeare, that are not Shakespeare at all.
Yes. I mean, we all assume there must be a balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. What did they do in Verona? They built a balcony in the 1930s in the Casa Giulietta so that there would be a balcony. But if nobody says balcony, it ain't a balcony. If nobody says heath, it isn't a heath. It's a way in which the language of a bare stage, the language of Shakespeare's theatre, which doesn't define location in the same way, can only create location when it speaks of location.
Yeah. That's right. Yes.
So speech becomes, all, in a certain sense, very powerful. Very powerful as an act of naming. Once you name it, you bring it into being.
And in the beginning was the word. It's
good line, that.
Yeah. It makes you pause.
Yep.
You know, when does something begin to really exist, right? Or not exist at all? This is just fabulous. I have 1,000 things that I would love to consider here, and I'm kind of forgetting them as I try to think of where to go from here. But I would like to, and I'm not sure how this. I think this fits. There's been a lot of talk recently about monuments and whether to keep monuments that are monuments to people who have done bad things. And of course, just like every other thing in the media gets polarized and so forth, it isn't nearly enough understanding of what that there might be some that you keep even if they're not squeaky clean. Others, obviously, this is no good for anybody. But I've been in touch with some people recently in Barcelona who are examining how to remember, and the Memory Institute and the European Memory Institute, where there's been a kind of consensus that, you know, when you get into these cities, you get into these things that are just so much part of our city, and you start stripping them down. There's a hold on a second, let's pause. Maybe they could be used as instructional, right? And
I would like to think they could be. I also recognize that it is difficult, as it were, to make people read the instructional material.
Yeah.
And what we are left with is something that speaks of itself in a way that we can't control. We face this at Notre Dame. In the main building, as it's always referred to, the Golden Dome building at Notre Dame, there is a set of murals about Columbus's discovery of America.
Yeah.
And its representation of the indigenous peoples that he encounters is horrible.
Yeah.
Simply horrible.
Yeah.
And eventually the complaints grew, rightly, coming from many of us, about how this can't be just left in the way it is. And the university took what I think still is the right, strong decision. It's covered the murals. So when you go into the main hall of the dome, the murals are there behind coverings. And on certain days of the year, the coverings are removed so that they can then be used for pedagogic purposes and so on.
Uh-huh.
We can do something that, on the one hand, talks about the skill of the artist, Luigi Gregorio, the artist who painted them. And on the other hand, we can use them to teach our students about acts of representation and how this is something that we don't find comfortable and we shouldn't find comfortable.
So a purposeful act of forgetting Columbus or forgetting how, yeah.
But not erasing them, not painting over them,
yeah.
not doing what John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, did when he was bailiff of Stratford-upon-Avon, painting over the wall paintings in the Guild Chapel. Now, one argument is they were whitewashed over so that the whitewash could then be washed off and they could be revealed again if the prevailing mood, the Protestant settlement of the Elizabethan era, changed yet again. And indeed, those wall paintings have now been revealed and we can go into the Guild Chapel and marvel at them. And they are marvelous. They are wonderful. I wouldn't want to lose them.
Yes.
But I also understand why, when John Shakespeare was effectively mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon, it was decided they should be painted over. This was not the version of the Christian religion that was currently the state policy.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a very difficult subject, but
it's horrendously difficult, and I think anybody who thinks they have a simple right answer is deeply mistaken. But I don't want to cancel things. I want to remember those things, and I want to remember that. Take an obvious example in the US. How many of those monuments to the Confederacy, to the Confederate generals and slave owners, were put up long after the end of the Civil War?
Oh, full on Jim Crow era, 1930.
Right through. I mean, it's the late
and as
19th century and well on.
A direct affront, a direct affirmation of the apartheid era that period was, and just a complete kind of audacity there, and
we don't want, therefore, to say these monuments never existed. I think the empty plinth is a mark of something.
I'm okay.
I don't want to take that away.
I'm okay with a couple of those, with those going down, the Jim Crow things. You know,
oh, yes.
take a photograph, and that flag, which was never really a Confederate rallying flag anyway, but that flag, put it in a museum. That's what, you know, people have eventually done. But
and yet we still see on cars driving around our streets Confederate flags on them. And we see them at all kinds of political demonstrations and rallies and so on. And I want to use that as a means of saying these are people who have never been willing to accept that slavery was a profound evil. And sometimes the ways in which we make that manifest can be difficult and interesting. I was in Liverpool a few years ago. It's not a city I know well. I wish I did know it better. But I went for the first and only time to the Museum of Slavery that is on the Liverpool docks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a great museum. It's not an astonishing museum, though it has some wonderful, wonderful things in it. But what it has at one point is one of the most brilliant pieces of museum thinking that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
And it is simply a very big wall, which is covered with standard street signs from Liverpool, street names, just the ordinary way in which a street name exists. And it doesn't say anything about these street names, except at one point it explains, just on the side, every single one of these streets is named after someone who made their money out of the slave trade.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you the individual history of all those people. That would not have the same effect it's after. It's after the effect that as you walk down your streets in your city, you are seeing acts of naming in memory of people whose background is the wealth from the slave trade.
Yeah.
And that's something that we need to remember. You know, when you walk down the street and it has a name as opposed to a kind of vague name, I live in South Bend on a street called Park Avenue. That's not difficult. But there are plenty of names even in South Bend, Indiana, that belong to people whose, they are named for people whose acts are not ones one wishes to remember, and yet we don't have a mechanism. We don't erase those names.
Yeah.
We don't do enough to remember those people.
Yeah. Because these going back a little bit to the Jim Crow thing, and this does tie into Shakespeare in some way, because we were talking about how you build a memory beyond the source. And these statues in every southern town, it seemed, that I went through, in my generation, none of us had any idea who those guys were. They had been completely forgotten. Whatever purpose that they had served in 1932, there might be a small group of people who would say, yes, well, he was one of our guys. I don't know, but they were. There was this effort to remember them wrongly, and then it may have been the influence of civil rights, aware that people just sort of, almost like you say, somehow covered them. Even though they were not covered, they just didn't exist anymore. You just didn't pay attention. Even with that effort to build these people into cultural memory, they were forgotten, which I guess is a good thing.
I think we do the same with Shakespeare. And Shakespeare has been an instrument of imperialism and repression over and over and over again, all over the world. And we need to remember what was done, as it were, in Shakespeare's name by using Shakespeare to do things to people. Yeah. And then we need to find ways of subverting and remaking those meanings in different ways thereafter. Yeah. I'm going to be teaching a course next semester that is filling me at the moment. This is that classic moment of, why on earth did I ever agree to teach this? But I'm team teaching with a brilliant younger colleague, Tarin Chun, who is an Asianist, who works on Asian spectacle, theatre, film, and so on. And we're teaching a course called simply Shakespeare and Asia. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be looking at all manner of things, but in particular, what excites us is the richness, the astonishing richness of Asian performance, remaking Shakespeare into its own versions, mm-hmm. making something for itself. How Japanese Lear is not Chinese Lear, is not Indian Lear, is not, etc., 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 and how the particularities of each culture's local and national and broader cultural meanings are created through Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Sometimes as an act of aggression towards how that Shakespeare has been previously used, and sometimes thinking about it anew, afresh, erasing, remaking, coming to know it differently. And I'm thrilled at the prospect of the course, and I'm equally delighted that indeed the modest number of students we decided to have as our maximum in the class, the class is full. So obviously it chimes with our students' interests in exciting ways. I have to say, the reason we are team teaching is that neither of us could do it without the other. Tarin doesn't feel that she's enough of a Shakespearean, and I know I'm not enough of an expert in Asian forms of theatre and film to do it without her help. But the joining of our mutual knowledge and incompetencies, I hope will produce something exciting for the students, and it's certainly going to be exciting for us.
Oh, it's good. It's topical. The idea of cultural appropriation hasn't been thought through, because people do that all the time, and they do it for a variety of reasons, and not all bad. Because you have, a first world society economy in Japan, and when they pull in Shakespeare, except for maybe a relatively few number of people might think of the iconic Shakespeare, but when you look at Ninagawa or Kurosawa or any number of that, I've been writing on this. There's just no sense that you cannot do exactly what you want to do with this, right?
Yes. It's
and they do.
material that cries out to be rethought and remade and reworked.
Yeah.
And we do it in different ways in much more familiar territory. It doesn't happen so much now, but whenever I used to show my students as part of a course on Shakespeare and film, 10 Things I Hate About You, there would always be a student who would say, I didn't know it was based on Shakespeare. Because why should they know? Nothing in the film says based on the play Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. And if you don't happen to know that it's true and pick up names like the name of the central female role, Cat Stratford, you wouldn't, as it were, get it. But now I'm afraid they know.
They know now.
And I
Yes.
think they my
Yeah.
students now, and they love the film, and they should do.
Yeah.
But
I don't
when
want
they
to
do,
I don't want to
sorry.
confess how old I was when I figured out the source for West Side Story.
Well, exactly,
You know,
exactly,
I was a young kid in band, and we played those songs
right.
from the production, and the great, just great score, and yeah, I didn't know until later.
You know the version that they originally were going to create long
Mhm.
before it reached its final version.
No.
Originally, it was not going to be about uh, white Americans and Puerto Rican immigrants. It was going to be about Jews and Catholics.
Ah, yes, yes. Is that in your book? No,
No,
it's
I
not.
don't
I
think
read
so.
that recently. I've talked to three scholars recently and read these books, and that they're getting conflated in my memory. But yes,
But
I did read this recently. It was supposed, and they didn't want it. It was too hot, right?
it was too hard. It was never going to work. But I would love to know whether now in the archives of all the people who were involved in that early development of the project, there is material talking about it, letters
Yeah.
to and fro. I haven't done the research. Perhaps everybody in musical theatre history knows about all of this already, and I just haven't seen the article that would tell me what I want to know. But I'm fascinated by, as it were, that alternative version that didn't happen, the
Yeah.
version that couldn't have happened, that would never have been the astonishing success it became.
Yeah. Ooh, I do remember very recently a friend of mine who engineer and never studied Shakespeare or anything, and
Mhm.
he said, "Well, I took my daughter to West Side Story." He said, and he calls me Tommy. He said, "Tommy, why didn't you tell me it had such a bad ending? We were out." I said, "Sam, you don't know that it's Romeo and Juliet. They die in the end. That's what
Except they
happens."
don't.
Yeah,
They don't. Only one of them dies.
only one of them in West Side Story, but
Yeah,
it's
it's
a
a
sad
50%
ending.
tragedy, as it
Yeah.
were.
Yeah, and he thought he was going to, a nice frivolous musical and take his daughter and so forth. And he goes, this is, and it's poignant. It's a poignant story, the way they do it, and of course Shakespeare. But my students are disappointed sometimes. Not all of them, of course, but I do have students, and I know they're thinking, "Oh, Shakespeare, that's Romeo, that's romance and love, and we're going to read a happy play." They're
Yeah,
not they're not quite aware
yeah.
of the fact that this is a tragedy
But
coming into class. So
but I don't think we need to protect our children from the confrontation with those kinds of tragedies. I mean, I think there may be an age at which the sexiness of Romeo and Juliet, the obscenity of Mercutio's language, and so on, that may be a different kind of problem. But the connection, the contemplation of death, that's not too bad.
no, that's part
I
of
mean,
art.
my parents didn't say when I was what 11, and they were taking me to that King Lear in London. It's a bit heavy. I don't know whether he's up to this or whether he needs protecting from it.
Yeah,
I mean, the first two productions I saw in Stratford upon Avon. One was A Midsummer Night's Dream, a famous production with Charles Laughton as Bottom, and the other was Othello,
yeah,
starring Paul Robeson, his return to the role in the 59-60 season. And because Robeson was a cultural hero in my family,
yeah,
and among the Jewish left, he was always a heroic figure. He was so much concerned to identify the connection between the struggles of his own racial identity and the struggles of the Jews,
Yeah.
that we wanted to see Robeson.
Yeah.
And seeing Robeson was more important than in a sense than seeing Othello. But of course, back then, only Robeson was playing a role like Othello. Other people were playing Othello in blackface.
Yeah.
In a way that we now find difficult and shocking and painful and plain wrong. I've written about Olivier's Othello, which I saw when it was there and at the Old Vic in the National Theatre in London, and I saw it. I don't use it in class. I don't know how to use it. I don't know what to do. I think I can't find a way to cope with it. I don't want to shock my students. I don't want to give them pain beyond some kinds of distress that perhaps are worth experiencing.
Well, Anthony Hopkins in the BBC version, and I used to. I'm guilty of using that for years. I don't anymore, and I think he did a fine job with it.
He did his best. You remember why he ended up playing it? Do you know?
I don't know that. No.
Oh well, they originally wanted to cast James Earl Jones and bring in a great American black actor to play Othello, and British Equity refused to allow him in.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh my.
And Equity, of course, I mean, for good reasons. They said, look, if you can't find a black British actor to play it, you're not going to, but they ended up going with Hopkins. And no, I can't look at that one either. There is something there that is far too painful. I mean, that is just totally and overwhelmingly wrong. I don't view this limitlessly. I mean, I do not believe for a moment that passionate though I am about my Jewish identity, that only Jews should play Shylock. But I also know that sometimes I see non-Jews playing Shylock and not quite being aware of what they're doing. And sometimes it happens even when it is a Jew playing Shylock. I mean, there was an example that I think it's very clear for me in this kind of area of, if you like, I don't want to say it's culture wars. It's not that. It's something much more profound, I think, than that. But the Royal Shakespeare Company production years ago, which had Anthony Sher as Shylock, had a moment when in the trial scene, there were other Jews in the courtroom with Shylock. And before he went to take the pound of flesh, they began chanting a piece of liturgy. And I knew which piece of liturgy it was. It's a familiar piece. It's a moment in the Passover service when we ask God to pour out his wrath upon the heathen and those who have attacked us. And yet it used in this way at that point, it somehow suggested that there was a piece of liturgy that is appropriate for committing a murder. And I came out fuming, distressed. My friends I was with didn't understand it because they didn't feel my hurt, as it were. And I couldn't explain it to them. I tried to, but it didn't register for them. Interestingly, one great scholar, great editor of Merchant of Venice, amongst much else, who did write about that moment was J. Hallio in his edition of Merchant, because he too found it distressing as a Jew to be confronted by that moment. And it's a moment when one's identity that is not visible, that is not the same as a visible racial identity, that does not make me a person of color, still others me in ways
it others you. Well, I'm going to let you go in a bit here because I know you have a feast prepared. But
it is time for the Thanksgiving turkey.
But I do want to spend a little bit of time because we've been on it. there is this feeling out there somewhere that we're in our ivory towers, and somehow some of us may have been born with a silver spoon, as they say. And and I wanted to, you're talking about your background being of the Jewish faith of a particular generation in the UK, which would be different than, say, in New York or
Oh
Chicago
yeah.
or whatever, although better or worse, who knows? But I would like you to just talk a little bit about your background, your upbringing,
Sure.
if you would. And you know, you came from this family. You ended up a Cambridge graduate and a distinguished professor, but that wasn't necessarily in the cards from your childhood.
No, it wasn't necessarily, but just the other week we had a week-long celebration on campus for first generation college students. We wanted to, I mean, this was the student body, wanted to encourage them. And they had what I call a badge and they call a button made for it.
Oh, good
And there it is. We are
generation.
the
That's it.
golden generation.
Yeah.
And I wore my badge. I asked for one of the badges because I am first generation college and I'm proud of being first generation college. And I don't find that a strange thing to do. My students, of course, assume that because I have uh, a relatively refined English accent, I must be at least eighth generation college, if not, you know, back to the founding of the University of Cambridge. Um, Far from it. No, I'm first gen college. My father was an immigrant from a shtetl in Poland. He came to England in 1927 when he was 16, along with three friends. They were actively engaged in political work, opposed to the Polish government, which
Yeah.
was, of
Yeah.
course, profoundly anti-Semitic.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and they were warned that they would risk arrest, and so they ran for it, and they hid away on the first boat in Gdansk that they could stow away on, not knowing where it was going. And as it happens, it went to London. And they came out of the boat and they got absorbed into the Jewish East End, which looked after you. And all you needed to do back then was get a job, show you weren't going to be a drain on the state, then turn yourself into the police, pay a fine, and you were there. And that was it. He didn't take out citizenship till much, much later, but that's the beginning, as it were. My mother was born in England. Her parents came from Russia. I think they met in London. I don't think they traveled together from Russia, but all of that is now lost. And there is no
Yeah.
way, you know, ancestry.com can't help us find details
Yeah.
of those kinds of families,
Yeah.
Jewish families migrating.
Yeah.
Um, and and yet none of my parents' generation went to college.
Yeah.
In my generation, six of us went to university amongst my cousins, and all of us went to Cambridge.
Yeah.
I was the youngest. I didn't go to Cambridge because my cousins had. I went to Cambridge because I wanted to go to Cambridge. It was the course I wanted, and so on. But we were encouraged to do so because of something in our background that encouraged learning for its own sake. I think my father was so profoundly proud that his son was going to college.
Oh, yes.
And that was something that he cherished. And he did one thing that has caused me a great deal of problems ever since. Before I started in Cambridge as a freshman, he opened accounts at the two local bookshops in Cambridge, in which the bills went straight to him. And he said, you know, I don't want you choosing between a book and a beer. You have your allowance and you can spend it any way you like, and I'm not interfering, and you know, but I don't want you to think of books as somehow not to be
Yeah.
bought. The reason it's a problem is I can't stop buying books, and nor my wife, and we live a life awash with endless heaps of books everywhere that we can't find space for, and retirement looms, and God knows what we're going to do with all the books
Oh
then.
my. The Cambridge that you attended was not the Cambridge you would attend now if you were from a Jewish background. I mean, I'm imagining that much more, how do you, much more, what you would typically think would be the student in your time than now, where you would see a far more diverse student body now. But
of course,
yeah,
and but not diverse enough, as Cambridge well knows.
yeah,
There aren't enough young people of colour going to Oxbridge for
yeah,
all kinds of obvious reasons to
yeah,
do with expectation and advantage and so on.
yeah.
It wasn't until I'd left Cambridge, and I spent 28 years in Cambridge continuously as an undergraduate, graduate student, postdoc, faculty, and so on, that I ever taught Othello with somebody who was black in the student group I was teaching.
Huh.
In my whole time in Cambridge, I did not ever go through that experience.
Mm.
And of course it's changed, and it's changing for the better, but it's a slow process of change. It will, I think, get there, and it needs to get there, and it knows it needs to get there. And the same is happening here at Notre Dame. The student body at Notre Dame is not as white as it was when I arrived 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The freshman class this year is 40% international students or diversity students.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of those international students are, of course, white students.
Mm-hmm.
But even so, the number has increased significantly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Shakespeare has a role to play in that, because Shakespeare can be an instrument of oppression, as we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
And also be a means of opening up areas of difficult conversation for us in our classrooms all the time in ways that matter.
Yeah.
And that it does it in our classrooms, it does it in the theatre, it does it in so many different places.
Yeah.
I was just watching a couple of days ago a film of a wonderful solo performance piece by an Australian performance artist, Deborah Lyson-Moore, which is called Cordelia Mein Kind. And it's about her relationship with her father and her father's relationship with King Lear, and her father's relationship in particular with a film version of King Lear, a version in Yiddish. So it's about a complex issue of where ownership, if you like,
Yeah.
of a text like King Lear begins to become played out,
Yeah.
and part of a relationship with one's parents' generation and grandparents' generation,
Yeah.
and those people for whom Shakespeare lived first in Yiddish before they ever encountered it in English.
Yeah. Well, so many people encounter Shakespeare here in Japanese before they get to the English.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Peter, I've kept you way too long. This is a holiday weekend for you, not for me here in Japan. But one of the advantages of being in the American Midwest is that you do get Thanksgiving. You do get Thanksgiving.
We do.
And it's a great time without the stresses of Christmas. Sometimes Christmas can be a little stressful. Thanksgiving, I've always found to be very relaxing. And so I would like you to stay just a moment after we finish, but I wanted for our audience and so forth to thank you so much again for joining us today on your Thanksgiving weekend.
And thank you, Tom, for giving me the opportunity. It's been a really fun conversation. Thank you.